Welcome to Wednesday Walks Together. My name is Mark Long, rector of the parish of St Andrew in Newlands, Cape Town. Today, amazingly, is the last Wednesday in July, and the year's moving on quickly. Despite lockdown, time is moving forward, and we move with it. Today, I'd like to share with you around a brief passage from Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. It begins in verse 1 with Paul saying, "I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship." And he goes on, and the second verse is the one I'd like to focus on today. "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." Now that's a challenging verse. Paul speaks about conforming to the world. What does it mean to conform? Essentially, it means to find a space in our social, economic, and political milieu where we are comfortable, where we don't stand out too much, where we kind of blend into the background. For many of us, that's largely how we live. Some of us perhaps a little bit more out there and willing to challenge the principles of the day. I'm wearing a camouflage top this morning, and if I was to go out into the garden, which is just on the other side of the screen here, and sit myself down in a flower bed with the mountain in the background, to some degree I would largely disappear. My face would probably stand out, but certainly my upper body would just blend in to the winter garden around me. That's really what conforming is all about, blending in. And Paul is challenging us in terms of our faith to say that that's actually not what we're called to, because there is so much in our social environment, our economic and political environment, that really works against the principles of what God has always been about, from the beginning of creation through to today. And so Paul encourages us to be transformed. And he focuses on the mind, because our thinking very often informs our action. Our thinking, of course, is often unconsciously formed by, of course, the attitudes of our day. And part of our wanting to blend in, part of our wanting to not be too discomforted or too discomforting to others, is that we, without thought often, just adopt the attitudes around us. And Paul is saying we need to be conscious of measuring what's happening around us against the principles of our faith. And of course, one of the huge principles of our faith is the principle of justice. And we need to be aware constantly of where injustice is taking place around us. And in that awareness, then having the courage to stand up and say, this is not right. But it's not sufficient necessarily to say this is not right. It is to offer a way forward as well. And I think, certainly from my own experience, I too often remain silent because I do not feel that I have an alternative for moving forward. Sometimes if one does not have that alternative, it's still sufficient to stand up and say this is wrong, because it ends up in conversation, hopefully, discussion with others, with the society, with the economic and political background that we're in enabling us to together begin to explore what it is that God desires of us. What is God's will? Scripture, of course, gives us some broad outlines of what God's will is, but we need to be interacting with the specifics of our own situation. And of course, the challenge is to apply those principles when we find injustices around us. And it's working together in applying those principles that enables us to actually work towards a just future. During lockdown, of course, one of the huge issues that has raised itself has been racism globally in our society. And it's not sufficient to just gloss over it. We do need to explore it. For people like myself, if you're in my generation, or maybe a bit older, having worked through the 70s and 80s in South Africa, There's a level of exhaustion in dealing with racism as an issue. But it's alive and well, clearly, otherwise people wouldn't be raising it in our own day and time. It's around alive and well in a different way. Under apartheid, it was legalized. It was in the statutes of our nation. Under democracy, we've, thank goodness, moved away from that kind of legal side of it. But we're still struggling with our relationships. And what we're experiencing is that racism is has infiltrated itself into the structures of our society. And it's incredibly difficult to remove it. We as human beings, we too often focus on the external differences we see in each other. And perhaps that's a helpful, just basic description of racism. When I choose to notice a difference in you that is essentially superficial, I'm embracing a racist attitude. And there's so much in the structures of our society, and I think that's what we're fighting today, is a structuralized racism. And it's an institutionalized thing. It's built into the girders of our social buildings around us and the institutions that drive our society. And we need to be finding the courage, I think, to both explore where racism exists, but also to then have the courage to call it when we see it, and beyond that, to begin to find ways to make changes that will increasingly not allow racism to be something that we experience. And so transformation in the context of Paul here in Romans becomes important. Paul speaks about a change of mind. And certainly in my own experience, I know how my thinking is so impacted by attitudes around me, unconsciously too often. And part of the need to face racism in our context is for me just to explore where those attitudes just reside in the structure of my own life, and to be conscious about changing those and finding new ways forward. One of the definitions of racism, of transformation, is that it is about a marked change in the form and nature of our relationships. And for me, that's so important, because ultimately, you and I are defined by our relationships, how we relate, who we relate with, and what informs the manner in which we relate with each other. The huge challenge for me is for us to see our common humanity in each other and to celebrate that common humanity. And in terms of transforming the form and the nature of our relationships, ensuring that in every instance of the manner in which we relate and work with one another, we can find ways to really celebrate the commonalities of all that we are. And so in seeking to do that, to find ways for equity to be part of the manner in which we relate, that becomes an inherent fairness, an inherent impartiality to the manner in which we relate one with another. And of course, as we do that, the ultimate gift is that we all begin to have a real and deep sense of belonging. Belonging in terms of our own family structures, belonging in terms of our social structures, belonging in terms of being part of Southern Africa and all that Southern Africa is in these times. So my challenge to us today, I think, as in this Wednesday walk, is, are we able to really hear the challenge of our faith, a call to stop conforming, a call to be transformed, a call to find a different way forward. And no matter what the issues are around us, to seek to really allow the principles of our faith to be life-giving and life-changing in the manner in which we live and relate one with another.